In this video, we'll look at XY and waveform graphs. XY and waveform graphs are very similar display types. The options are the same for both graphs and they look identical. The only difference is what can be displayed on them. Waveform graphs will only view waveforms. Usually these are time-based. XY graphs are for viewing curves. But when we look at these in SoundCheck, remember any setting can be applied to either graph type. So here, we're looking at a fundamental, which is a curve, displayed on an XY graph, with mostly default settings. If we right-click on the y-axis, we can see a few different settings here. But notice that auto scale is enabled. Auto scale will best fit the axis to the curve that's displayed. If I add another curve to the display that have the same units, like harmonic 2, the y-axis will best fit both curves. The y-axis automatically scales to show both. Instead of 68 to 90, it now shows 10 to 90. If I remove harmonic 2, it again auto-scales to show only the y range appropriate for the fundamental. Now I'll disable auto-scale. Nothing changes here, but if I drop in harmonic 2, I don't actually see it. The y-axis doesn't change to best fit the curves, it just remains static, 68 to 90 dB SPL. So how do I see harmonic 2? I can highlight the top or bottom numbers on the y-axis to set the maximum or minimum y-axis values. I type in 20, the graph now shows down to 20 dB, and if I typed in 100 at the top, it'll go from 20 dB SPL to 100 dB SPL. You can actually change these upper and lower settings when auto-scale is enabled, but if a curve gets removed, added, or the display step runs, it will auto-scale again. Another option on the y-axis is Format. This can change how the values are displayed on the axis. Right now, it's set to SI, which is the International System of Units. We can also change this to decimal or absolute time. For this y-axis, and most of them, absolute time really doesn't make any sense. But we can switch to decimal. And on this graph, it really doesn't look like anything changed. There's no difference between the two. To illustrate the differences, I'll instead pull up a waveform graph. This is a recorded time waveform of an impedance measurement, and the y-axis is in volts. If I switch this to decimal, the graph looks pretty useless. All I'm seeing for units are negative 0.0 to 0.0. This brings us to the option to set precision. Precision will change how many decimal places are shown. Right now it's set to 1, so on this graph we're looking at minus 0.0 to 0.0. If instead I switch it to 4, I can see that it now goes from minus 0.0080 to 0.0080 volts. So this is the same as minus 8 millivolts and positive 8 millivolts. The last option we can select is the mapping mode. This switches between linear and logarithmic graphing. On waveform graphs, linear is almost always the way to go. Logarithmic usually doesn't make a lot of sense. And when reviewing this fundamental, the y-axis units are already logarithmic, they're dB SPL, so viewing linear is much more common. The options on the x-axis are the exact same as the y-axis. We can enable or disable autoscale, set a format, change the precision, and then switch the mapping mode. Here, is where changing the mapping mode to linear or switching the format to absolute time could be necessary. A common use case of this would be using the strip chart recorder. The strip chart recorder will output a curve even though the x-axis is time-based. If in the strip chart recorder I defined to output absolute time, I would want to change the x-axis to also graph in absolute time. On this example though, I just had the time set to relative. It's showing me the time as logarithmic, and that doesn't really make any sense. Here I would want to change the x-axis mapping mode to linear. Now it's showing my x-axis from 0 to 10 seconds in linear mode, and I can view my curve the way that I need to. In the bottom right of graphs, there is a caret that will expand the controls. This allows us to select between 3 different tools in the bottom left of the graph. The first is the arrow, which is the default. This will allow clicking and right-clicking on the graph. We'll look at some right-click options in a little bit. The magnifying glass allows us to zoom in. We can select which axes to zoom in on. If we select XY, we can just highlight an area in the graph and it will zoom in. If we specify X, we can only zoom in on the X-axis. The Y is fixed. Same thing with Y. If I click Y, I can zoom in on the Y, but I can't change the X-axis zoom. When already zoomed in, selecting Autoscale will autoscale the entire graph to best fit the displayed items. The hand tool allows the graph to be moved around. Let's say if I zoom in on an area, I can switch to the hand tool and drag the graph around to view different parts with that same zoom. The X and Y1 buttons will autoscale just the X or Y axis respectively. So when I'm zoomed in and click Y1, it autoscales the graph to the Y axis but leaves me zoomed in on the X. Now if I click X, it will autoscale that and it brings the full graph back into view. In the top right of the graph, we have a legend that shows all items that are being displayed. By clicking on the area to the right of the name, I can change settings for that item. At the top, disabling Plot Visible will just hide that item from the current display. Common plots allow selecting from different options to display curves. Curves are just multiple x, y, and z points, and the first setting will draw a line between these on xy graphs. The second setting only shows the points. Next is a combination of the two. It draws a line between the points, but also highlights the points on the graph. We can fill the graph, make vertical lines to each of the points, or show a bar plot. Sometimes it's even necessary or recommended to change these. For example, if we look at a curve with only a single point on it, we can't draw a line between multiple points. It would look like there's no data. But if we look at it and set it to have points available, we can clearly see where this is. Another option if you're only using a single point piece of data is to display it on a table, which we'll look at in depth in the next video. Here, I have an RTA curve. These are 1/nth octave measurements, and the current display works okay here, but the lines really aren't what we measured. It would be more appropriate to set the display to view a bar plot. For the next setting example, let's look at two similar curves, THD and THD normalized. Sometimes, especially with a large number of curves on a single graph, it can be a bit tricky to see where one starts and the other begins. To clarify that, we can change line styles and widths. I'll change THD to a dotted line, and then we can clearly see where the two overlap. There are multiple different patterns of dotted lines if you have multiple overlapping curves. Changing the line width will increase or decrease the actual line size. Now let's go back to the RTA XY graph and look into the bar plot menu. One bar plot option was available under Common Plots, but down here we can change it to horizontal or vertical orientation, change the spacing between the bars, the width of the displays, and underneath this we can even specify the fill base line. Currently it's set to fill to 0. That doesn't really make sense. You can see there's one area that's a negative measurement. We don't really want to be filling it back to the 0 point. So we could change this to fill to negative infinity or even positive infinity. In this specific use case, filling to negative infinity, the graph will match more visually with what the actual measurement is. Interpolation will change where the bar plot is graphed in reference to where the point is. So the point could be on the right side of the bar, the left side, the center, etc. These different options will just change where the point is that's being graphed. Point style will change the look of the displayed points. This will only affect plots that are actually showing the points. We can select between circles, squared, filled, empty, etc. And whatever we pick here will be the points that are displayed on the graph. The last setting in this menu to talk about is color. This is probably the most common option that you'll be going in and changing. We discussed in the previous video how to set default colors for all graph types. If you want the color to be changed in an individual graph, you can set it here, and that color will override the default settings. If that same curve is displayed on the same display step, it will also inherit the selected color. By right-clicking on the graph when the arrow tool is selected, it will bring up the display menu. The first option here can copy the image to paste it into a completely different program. You can change between the different tools, and this is the same as clicking the icons in the lower left-hand corner. Cursors 1 and 2 can be added, but you must be right-clicking on a curve, or a waveform. I right-click on a curve, then I can either place it in the location that I clicked by dropping it here, or snap it to the maximum or minimum point. Once placed, it will show the name of the curve it is currently on, along with the X and the Y points. By clicking on the cursor, it can be dragged to different areas. If a second cursor is added, in the bottom right, it will show the delta between the X and the Y of the two cursors. So as I drag one along, the bottom right will read out the delta between the two. To get rid of a cursor, right-click, select the cursor menu, and then remove. The legend can be moved from the top of the display to the right of the display. Especially when a large amount of curves are on a graph, the legend at the top can sometimes increase and squash down the actual room to display the curves. Moving the legend to the right gives you more room for a larger number of curves and doesn't waste as much space. Auto Size Legend will automatically adjust the size of the legend to show the full name of any items that are displayed. With this disabled, the legend can be manually changed to be as big or as small as desired. With auto size enabled, if I add on a curve with a longer name, say like THD Normalized, the legend will automatically scale to fit this new, longer name. The legend can also be toggled between being visible or hidden. If you know the curves that are displayed and you don't want it taking up room, you can just turn it off completely. All curves have X, Y, and Z data, but by default, we are only seeing X and Y. This is reflected in the right-click menu by only seeing the magnitude enabled. If we want to look at the Z data, we can enable phase. Phase will always appear as a lighter color of the magnitude curve. So the fundamental phase is a light pink curve. Notice the secondary y-axis now appears, showing degrees, which is the unit of those phase curves. If we look a little deeper at the fundamental phase, we can see it makes a large jump around 200 Hz. This is wrapped phase. All points must be within plus or minus 180 degrees, and if they go outside of that, they will wrap back around. Instead, if we wanted to see unwrapped phase, we can enable that option. Now the range of phase is much larger because it's showing us unwrapped. It won't make the jump, it will just continue. It's also possible to only show phase. Once it has been enabled alongside magnitude, we can go back in and disable magnitude. Now our graph will only show phase. The next section allows reports to be created, or the image of the graph to be saved out as JPEG or bitmap. Randomize colors will randomize any curves displayed in the graph, picking from the default graph palette colors. Resetting curve colors will bring back the default colors from the graph palette, and resetting graph colors will do the same for the graph colors. For more details on this, please see the previous video, Default Graph Palettes. I've completely changed around my default graph palette just to have some different colors for the next menu option example. So in the right-click menu, we'll now look at Preferences. There's a lot of different things we can do here, but the first is I'll simply change the title of my graph from the generic XY Graph 1 to Frequency Response. This will make it a little bit easier to track, especially as I add on some more graphs. That name now appears in the upper left-hand corner. Going back to Preferences, I can change the size of the Listen logo, move the position around, and switch between black and white. I can move it to the bottom left corner, make it small, and make it white. The legend options are the same settings that we get through the right-click menu. And here is where I can set my graph colors. My default background is black with orange and green cursors because that's what I set in my default graph palette. But these graph settings will override that default color. So if I set this to white, only this graph will now have a white background. Opening up new XY and waveform graphs will still show the default black background, but frequency response will always be white. We can do the same thing with cursor colors. On the X-axis tab, we have some of the right-click options. We can change the scale between linear log and set the range. Free means that auto scale is disabled. So if you right-click and disable auto scale, that's the same as enabling free in Preferences. Standard axis ratio is grayed out for now, but we'll come back to that. Grid lines can be enabled or disabled. The T in minor grid lines means they're transparent, so even though they're enabled, they're not visible. If we want to actually see them, we'll need to change the color. Going back to Preferences, we have the same options on the y-axis, plus the additional Auto Offset. This is a little bit close to Auto Scale because it attempts to best fit the display curves, but will do so within the range specified. So if I pick 60, it will attempt to fit all of the curves displayed within a 60 dB window. If I go back and increase it to 100, it will once again try to fit them, but this time it makes it. Y2 is disabled until a different y-axis is required. If I add THD normalized, that y-axis is in percentage, so Y2 will be selectable. In the preferences, the exact same settings as Y are available. Now that we have Auto Offset enabled, let's go back to the X-axis tab. We can see that Standard Axis Ratio is now selectable. With this enabled, it will lock the X and Y aspect ratio. No matter what the size of the graph is changed to, the ratio of the defined y-axis will match a decade on the x-axis. In the next video, we'll go over the display settings of table, text, and pictures.